Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of Wheats on Your Mind, we're talking about wheat down under, the wheat industry in Australia. The country of Australia is one of the world's largest wheat producers and is a major export competitor of the United States. Our guest is Guy Allen. Guy is the Senior Agriculture Economist with the IGP Institute at Kansas State University. He started serving as Senior Economist for IGP at K-State in the spring of 2019. In that role, he facilitates programs in marketing, supply chains, and risk management of agriculture commodities. But Guy's extensive career in grains and commodity spans 3 continents: North America, Australia, Asia, and China. He has a vast experience in commodity trading and risk management, supply chain logistics, and commodity analysis. While in Australia, Guy went on during 1995 to establish the grain grading division for GrainCorp operations in Sydney when Australia's domestic market deregulation began. Over a 7-year period, he grew that business to maturity. So Guy has obviously a lot of experience with Australia, so he's the man we turn to today. And Guy, welcome.
Good to be here, Aaron. Thank you.
So the wheat industries in the U.S. Kind of evolved independent of each other, different times and different reasons. I think it's a good idea to kind of compare and contrast these 2 major wheat producers. So let's start at that 30,000-foot level. Give us a general overview of wheat production in Australia, where it's grown, and what it is specifically they grow.
Yeah, well, specifically, a lot of differences between Australia and the U.S. In the U.S., we historically grow hard red winter wheat, particularly here in Kansas. Up in the Pacific Northwest, we have introduced some white wheat varieties. When we look at Australia, Australia is predominantly a white wheat grower. We plant it in the fall and harvested in the spring. From a timing point of view, annually they'll be starting their wheat planting here in March, April, May, maybe up into June, and the harvest commences in the north of the country up in Queensland in late October, and then moves south and finishes up down in the southern part of Australia in December, sort of opposite the way we move here across the wheat belt in North America.
So geographically there, you're referring to kind of the eastern part of Australia.
Yeah, eastern. The western belt, you can sort of split Australia into 2 parts, Western Australia and Eastern Australia, and from a trade point of view, they're almost 2 countries, 2 separate regions. There's not a lot of trade between the 2, given their geographical distance. It's as different as California versus the East Coast. Your protein wheats are predominantly grown in Queensland, central and southern Queensland, northern New South Wales, where with the more milder temperatures there in southern New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and particularly in Western Australia, it's your softer 10.5% protein wheats.
There are different classes of wheat. Much like in the United States here, we have 6 different classes of wheat. Is that the same with Australia?
Not the classes of wheat as we would think a class of wheat. Australia is predominantly white wheats across the board. There is a little bit of red winter wheats that has been introduced, but that predominantly is grown for the feed market. So it's pretty much white wheat. Now, when they set up their grading structure in Australia is basically by a quality grade, and with protein being a component of that. For instance, your Australian standard white is generally your lower protein wheat. It needs to make milling quality. And then as you move up the line to Australian premium white, that's minimum 10.5. Your Australian hard is up to 11.5 protein. And then your Australian prime hard wheat, which is grown northern New South Wales and Queensland, that's 13% or higher. And it needs to make specific varietal requirements as well as protein and other milling specification. A lot of those quality specifications came in the wake of under the Statutory Marketing Board. The Australia had statutory marketing for over 60 years, beginning in the late 1920s, early 30s. Then in the late 80s, early 90s, due from grower efforts, it moved from a fair average quality standard to they started segregating, particularly due to protein and other quality factors. And that was brought in under your single desk statutory marketing. Now, that history of statutory marketing is fairly interesting because the market structure in Australia for 60 years, the Australia producer grew the wheat or grew the grain. They then delivered it to their local silo or grain elevator, which was built by a state bulk handling board. It was moved to port specifically and other destinations by the state-owned rail system and at public tariff rates, and then it was marketed by the statutory board, whether that was the Australia Wheat Board, the Australia Barley Board, the Australia Oats Board, whatever. Each commodity had its board. And then the average price for fair average quality grain was then distributed to the grower based on that single desk system. In 1989, the domestic market was deregulated. Prior to 1989, you couldn't sell grain to your local flour mill or local feedlot. You could use it on farm, but all the marketing was done through the statutory boards. So that the domestic market deregulated in 1909 and opened up the domestic market, which predominantly impacted eastern Australia. There's really no domestic market in the West. There's only 500,000 people in Western Australia, no real livestock sector, no real domestic milling demand. There's a little bit, but nothing to really be significant. Then the export market was deregulated in 2010, and they have moved now to a fully deregulated market. But to understand some of the nuances and the peculiarities of Australia, you need to understand that history of 60 years of statutory marketing.
The farmer then in eastern Australia, they didn't have to, they were told which varieties they have to plant then, planted it, focused on the agronomic part of it, and then just delivered the grain.
Correct, yeah. The focus was to increase your farm revenue. Your best way to do that was to increase yield and production. It was all production focused because all the marketing was done by the statutory boards.
Yeah, so let's step back a few steps just to the basics. I'm sure people listening are curious to how Australians get their wheat seed, how they get their inputs, their farming equipment. How does it compare to what a farmer here in Kansas might see?
Well, today it's pretty similar. On the inputs, a lot of the fertilizers imported, particularly your nitrogen and your phosphate. The soils in Australia are quite old. You don't see quite the demand for potassium. The one peculiar thing is there is significant areas of Australia that have a demand for micronutrients, whether that's sulfur, zinc, molybdenum, copper, etc. And so in some areas, those micronutrients are significantly important for getting a yield. On your seed isn't too much different. You see Pioneer present down there and DeKalb historically. Some of the universities down there, Sydney University in particular, has done, and University in Western Australia has done genetic work at improving that, and that has evolved over a good length of time to get varieties appropriate for various areas of Australia. So in that way, it's quite similar to the U.S. in the industry side of things.
Is the farmer going to harvest their own wheat, store it on site, or take it in right away?
Most of the grain historically has moved to the local silo system, which originally was a state-based bulk handling system. Those have now been privatized. Grain Corp is probably the dominant one on the east, where they merged with Queensland and Victoria. In the west, it's cooperative bulk handling. In Western Australia, CBH, or cooperative bulk handling, receives over 90% of the production of total grains and oilseeds. Where in the east, because you have a domestic market, you do have some private investment, including Cargill, including Viterra, including a couple other companies that have a presence there.
Yeah, so let's talk again a little bit about deregulation of the industry or moving away from that single marketing desk. Part of that happened because of the oil for wheat scandal, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, the Iraq war. Tell us about that impact and how things look differently today.
Originally, these started as state weight-based bulk handling statutory boards. Thing to keep in mind in Australia, on the East Coast we have 3 gauges of rail. New South Wales has standard gauge rail, Queensland has narrow gauge rail, and Victoria has broad gauge rail. And that rail transport was set up to move commodity, not only grain but coal, ore, from upcountry to the port. So it's an east-west movement, and it's not necessarily a long movement. It's probably the longest in New South Wales. Victoria, Queensland, Southern Australia particularly are definitely within in road distance. So you don't get that north-south movement. The only board that was national was the Australia Wheat Board. On that back in the 1930s, a lot of that really gained traction during the Great Depression when commodity prices got quite cheap, and that's when they really gained traction to market that grain internationally on that. And as I said, they were responsible for selling the grain both domestically and internationally and would facilitate those sales.
So how much wheat stays in country in Australia on a typical year?
On a typical year, probably about 10 million metric tons, I would say, depending on the year and the quality. But there's about 3.5 million tons today that is consumed domestically for flour and industrial use. Population's been pretty steady, so flour consumption is just above 2 million. There is some ethanol and some gluten production down there, which takes another chunk there as well. And then Australia, because of the dryness of the continent, they don't produce really any corn at all. So their feed ration is a wheat-based feed ration. The competing feed grains to wheat would be barley, sorghum, and other commodities. And the main consumer of that is the poultry sector for domestic consumption, also the cattle sector. And the cattle sector, very similar to Kansas and western Kansas, we compete head-to-head with Australia in the fed beef cattle market, into those markets of Korea, Japan, currently China, and in that fed beef market. And it's a wheat-based market, feed ration, not corn.
Let's break it down, talk a little bit about Western Australia. I know you and I have chatted about that before. It's just a completely different animal. Tell us about the logistics in that part of Australia, how things move and where they move.
Yeah, look, Western Australia has 4 basic ports, the biggest one being Kwinana, down by Fremantle, south of Perth, Geraldton, and Albany, and all those are within. They move it by rail, but it can be trucked fairly easily. Western Australia has a fairly sandy soil, doesn't retain hardly any water at all, so they always sort of need rain over there. Generally half or maybe a little more of Australia exports will come out of Western Australia, and this is generally white wheat in that range of, say, 10 to 10.5% protein. And probably the primary destination for that wheat is into Indonesia for one, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, even into China. But that's that Western Australia market is very much an export-focused market.
Any subsidies, government subsidies for farmers in Australia, price supports, insurance programs like we have over here?
No, not really. Australia is very much sort of exposed to the brunt of the free market. When I first went down there in the 1990s, being American, I caught a lot of flack for our export enhancement program and the government programs and that. It was the late 90s when the government decided to get out of agricultural subsidies on the export side of things. So I spent a lot of my time saying, well, that's historical. We've moved on from that now. Crop insurance is one, given Australia's volatility in production, particularly in rainfall. It's a lot like western Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. I think there's a place for weather derivatives down there, but they just have not taken hold. They're quite expensive. And I think one of the things when you compare the U.S. Current program with their crop risk insurance and that's subsidized by the government, that does give the U.S. producer a significant advantage, particularly in committing to production, particularly if you're competing with a marginal area like Australia, where 1 out of 4 to 6 years, you will have a drought and a significant weather event that impacts your production.
Well, staying in that part of the world, you talked about a lot of the Western Australia wheat going to Indonesia, and of course that's the exploding market. China, Indonesia, and East Asia, and the United States is competing for that with Australia. But The one advantage the Australians have is freight. Just looking at a map, and things are closer. Right?
It's significantly closer, and something I don't think we fully appreciate here when we look at those markets globally, export markets, is the volatility and the dynamics that we see in that international freight rates, particularly the dry bulk market. And we look at that dry bulk market basically by looking at the Baltic Exchange dry bulk index. We've seen significant volatility that in just the last 2 years. We've seen that index rally as high as 5,750. Today it sits at just under 680. A lot of that volatility has come out of issues from Australia, but when those freight rates get high, that comparative advantage in transportation and freight means a significant dichotomy in value. Back where we're at today we're at 2.5-year lows. It sort of evens up the playing field a bit. They still have a comparative advantage, but it's single digit, maybe $10 a ton at the most, whereas it's not $20-$30 a ton as we saw in mid or late 2021.
But as you mentioned, they are coming off an all-time record wheat crop.
Yeah. Look, one thing that Australia has been struggling with, this is the third year in a row that they've had a record winter crop. Mm-hmm. And the old adage, rain makes grain, just like in western Kansas, very true in Australia. And, you see pictures of the floods and the losses in that. But I was reading, somebody grew a 400-acre crop out in Alice Springs, which is in the middle of the country, significantly desert, and he hadn't done that for 46 years. But they do have a record crop, and with the volatility in the crop, the investment in infrastructure makes that quite challenging, because it's not like in the U.S. where you get a pretty consistency of volume. And if your volume can vary from 0 to a few 100,000 tons in a particular area, investing in a silo, permanent storage, investing in transportation assets and rail, just doesn't pay back. That's why you see a lot of temporary storage in those areas. And the challenge they've had the last 2 years particularly, and we'll see this current year, is export capacity. While there's a lot of little ports around Australia, they're sort of limited in their capacity. Not all of them are deep draft ports like Port Kembla or Newcastle or Geelong. You can load Panamax vessels on that. So we've seen last year particularly, construction's not the right word, but a number of temporary loading facilities being established at ports where they're bringing truck grain in and have a port loading machine there where you don't have permanent infrastructure, but it's temporary infrastructure to help facilitate that export capacity.
So what is the competition for that export capacity? Other commodities, what are we talking about?
It sits alongside, for instance, Newcastle loads 125 million metric tons of coal a year. It's the largest coal loading port in the world. The second biggest commodity is wheat, and I think the last couple of years it's been just over 1 million tons. So that's less than 1%. So they run alongside, and the rail infrastructure helps that. But from a grains point of view, what's competing for that export capacity is wheat, barley, canola. In the summer crops, you'll have sorghum. You also have potentially cottonseed and some other smaller crops as well. A lot of those now tend to move by containers. There's been a significant growth in that intermodal situation, particularly in eastern Australia on that. So just similar here to the U.S., the various commodities will compete for storage and handling and elevation capacity through the supply chain.
When you talk about temporary storage, is it similar to ground piles that we have here, covered ground piles?
Well, it's covered bunkers. The thing you can appreciate is Australia summers are very, very hot. Daily temperatures 120, very, very common. So the wheat comes in very dry. 10.5% will be the average moisture in my ground pile. Well, you can appreciate when wheat gets that dry, you really don't have an insect problem. So it'll be covered bunkered ground piles, and they're easy to put out when you've got dry weather. They're covered tarps. The grain will keep there for a year pretty easily. You do have similar sort of challenges of you do with any ground pile, but you don't have that moisture issue like we do here in the Midwest. And it's hot and dry rather than cold. When we think of ground piles, we're putting them out in the fall. When it gets cold, we're picking them up by March, and we're keeping it in the refrigerator with temperatures like we're having today in Kansas. So it is different, but and ground piles, they take a bit more labor, but you don't have that long-term fixed capital investment. And when you drive across, so that's where you've seen the significant growth in the supply chain infrastructure.
Yeah. So you mentioned 3 years in a row of record crop here, but if I recall correctly, 4 years prior to that, pretty devastating drought in the eastern part of the country.
Yeah, look, we go from feast to famine down there. The 4 years prior to that, we were in a major, 50, 100-year drought situation. And again, it reflects back to how are you going to spend your capital down there when you're barely getting a feed. A lot of, for instance, at Grain Corp, where I worked, in some of those years, in those drought years, half your facilities you just wouldn't open up. We had 400 facilities across eastern Australia, and there just wasn't enough local production to open those up. As the crop production sort of diversified, particularly with canola coming in, we use some of the smaller facilities to say this is a canola facility, this is a barley facility, this is a wheat facility. So not too dissimilar from the U.S. Your producers, you needed to buy a truck and haul your grain a little bit further to get to your first point of origin.
Yeah. So let's dive into your markets, or Australian markets, a little bit here. We talked about China and Indonesia, but not only for wheat. It's interesting to hear about sorghum and barley being in Australia. And barley, I think you mentioned, had its 4th largest crop ever. So it's a pretty dynamic market, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about barley just in a number of dimensions. In 2020, I forget which month it was, China, because of geopolitical issues, and they didn't like Australia's stance, one on COVID and on a number of things, they slapped an 80% import tariff on Australia barley. Mm-hmm. And what we saw in the wake of that was a shift. Most of that shifted from out of barley production into canola production, a little bit of an increase in wheat in the wake of that. So it did force a production change. The other thing it forced them to do was to diversify their barley marketing. China is annually the largest destination for barley, for both feed barley and malting, and that's because they've 1.4 billion people there, large market for malting barley for beer. Well, so they had to struggle a bit, and they've significantly diversified that where countries, particularly in the Middle East now, are a big buyer, particularly of feed barley. That Southeast Asia, Japan are your big buyers for your malting barley going into to beer production on that. But even with the wake of that, and those 80% tariff is still in place, with lower acres, we're having the 4th largest barley crop down there. And I think, one, it's rain makes grain, but two, the production practices, similar to here in the U.S., farmers are getting better at improving that yield over time.
Yeah, how agile are the farmers in shifting from wheat to barley to canola? Is it winter barley, winter canola, same farmers?
Yeah, look, it's very much when you drive across the Midwest, particularly Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, it's corn and soybeans. Mm-hmm. Down there, it's basically wheat canola. Canola is a crop that's come in probably in the last 20 years since I first went down there, and it's quite something to drive across there in August, September when that canola, it's a bright mustardy yellow. Mm-hmm. And you got your patchwork quilt of green wheat fields and bright yellow canola fields that are in bloom. So it's basically become a wheat canola rotation. Prior to that, their main production was wheat, barley, oats, all grasses. They did break that up a bit with some pulse crops like lupins, faba beans, chickpeas are still quite popular, and mung beans a bit with that legume. But that advent of canola coming in, particularly on the wake of higher vegetable oil prices, canola is 44% oil, has really given that rotation similar consideration. And canola, wheat, barley, oats are all winter crops.
Is there a general rule on which one of those crops has a better return per acre?
Well, that varies year to year, and just like here in the U.S., when you're comparing your corn, soybeans, and wheat crops, or if you want just your summer crops of corn, soybeans, sorghum, they sit down and do their budgets. They overlay their agronomic preferences on that, and make their production decisions. In a lot of areas, the other thing that comes into that is their livestock sector, particularly sheep for the most part. Australia grows 80% of the world's wool, and historically that wheat wool rotation was part of that, so that particularly on the not so much cattle but the sheep production will come into that rotation consideration as well.
What kind of effect did COVID have on that agriculture marketplace? Australia was a little bit different from some other countries in that they almost shut their borders in many cases.
Yeah, well, they did shut not only their national borders but their state borders as well. A lot of times those things impact the capital cities, not so much the rural regional areas, but COVID had a significant impact on the rural regional areas as well. I think day to day, from an agricultural point of view, very similar to the U.S., it's not a human resource intense. And farmers tend to work alone and by themselves. So from a production side, it didn't disrupt it so much. Where we saw the disruption, very similar to here, was in the cattle side, in the livestock chain, which is very, very important to Australia, both beef and lamb production and wool, but also in the supply chain availability of fertilizer and chemical, because all of those inputs are pretty much imported. And as long as those import supply chains were open, they were fine. But when you had a hiccup there, it's a big hiccup.
Yeah, I imagine so. Shifting gears here a little bit to technology. I mean, we talk a lot about wheat genetics here and different advances on that forefront. In many cases, Australia seemed to be ahead of the U.S. in that game, particularly GMO traits, and now we have GMO in the news. From your vantage point, seeing the technologies that farmers in the U.S. and Australia have, genetics and otherwise, who do you give the edge to on that?
I'd say they're different. There's a big, strong green push in Australia, a real strong pushback on for non-GMO. And given the size of that market, for a while there, that debate went away because they just were going to stay green. The issue that recently came up with Argentina's introduction of GMO wheat has sort of brought that back to the table. The Australians are quite innovative, and they have good underlying research and technology to support that. They just don't. What they lack is the critical size of the market to initiate that. Where I'd say I see the biggest difference is farming across most of Australia, again, is like western Kansas, so it's all about conserving moisture. And they were early adapters, particularly with the large broadacre production of GPS guidance system, tram track production to minimize compaction because they don't have the freeze and thaw compaction, and salinity is a real problem there. And just one thing I saw down there on the controlled traffic and with the genetics has made the wheat significantly shorter, the dwarf varieties, which increases yield. With the tram tracks, that works pretty good with the no-till. The row spacing is probably about 13 inches or so, and they have had some increase in herbicide resistance, particularly in ryegrass and some other things with Roundup resistance. And we've seen, I would argue, we've got the wheat so short now, you don't get that full canopy over the controlled traffic, and that lets the later season, germinating season weeds, particularly like ryegrass and that, come on up through there. And so that, particularly where you're controlling moisture, controlling those evasive weed species is real important.
We better take a step in it and define what tram track is for us.
Basically, you're driving down the same track in through the field every year. It's laid out so whether you're planting or spraying or whatever you're doing, you're driving down the same track through the field on that. So then next year when I plant my wheat, if they're a 13-inch, 12-inch row spacing, you move over 6 inches, and then you leave your wheat stubble, but you're planting between last year's rows on that. That leaves that cover, stubble cover on that to help to control weeds and conserve moisture. interesting thing on that with the technology, it used to be, I'd say when I went down there in the early 90s, late 80s, you got this Newell Highway that runs up the middle of the eastern wheat belt. 50% of the wheat used to be grown east of that, 50% west of that. Well, with the improved technology now, 2/3 of your wheat in an average year is grown west of the Newell Highway, which that's drier country. We're growing wheat on country that will receive maybe 14 inches of rain. It's all about timing of moistures. Any Kansas wheat grower will tell you it's not necessarily how much you get, but when you get it, and being able to conserve that moisture on that. So with the technology, not only your genetics, your chemical application, your tillage, but also just your equipment, has really allowed that wheat belt to move on more and more marginal country, which coming back to your crop insurance question, is you're growing wheat on more and more marginal country, becomes more and more risky. Your yield volatility goes up and down, your production goes up and down, so it just adds a lot of uncertainty to the whole industry.
Yeah, speaking of uncertainty, we have other issues here like labor shortages. Are they facing the same kind of problem?
Yeah, look, Australia's had a labor shortage in rural regional areas for a good number of years. That's been perennially a problem, I'd say, all the way through their history. Part of it's the way the country's structured, with a lot of the jobs and economics centered in the capital cities of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. In the west, it would be Perth. That's where the jobs are. That's where the young people migrate to get jobs and raise their family. And when the drought came through 4 years ago, it just totally devastated the rural regional social fabric as people moved to work. Agriculture, particularly in mining, is the basis of those rural regional economics, and labor's always been short. So coming back to your supply chain issues, when you invest in supply chain, when I build a grain facility down there, you do it so that it operates with minimal human resources.
Right.
Hopper bottom bins, you don't have flat bottom bins. You automate things because you just can't go out and hire that seasonal help.
Yeah.
One thing that the government has done to help address that seasonal is they do offer working holiday visas if you're under 30, to encourage young people to go down there to Australia, work in the rural regional areas, take up these agricultural hospitality jobs. And I've had a number of people go down there and stay for a year, possibly two if you're in a rural regional area, to take up those agricultural jobs of particularly working on farms, moving with the harvest very similarly like they do here. There's a fairly intensive fruit and vegetable industry down there as well. So they need that seasonal farm help. And one thing that they've done to address that is in their visa program. And if you're a young person looking for some adventure and a working type holiday, I would really encourage that.
Yeah, I think they try to do that here with the visa program in the U.S., and the trick is to get them here and then get them married before they go home, and then they can stay here. So, one more broad market question for you, Guy. So we've seen the wheat market for the United States evolve so significantly over the last 40 years, where the U.S. exported most of their wheat to what was the Soviet Union, and then our Middle East share of the marketplace kind of going away recent history. Now our eyes are turned, especially from the central United States, to South America and Central America. Has that kind of evolution happened in Australia over the decades, or has their marketplace been a little bit more stable?
No, look, the global marketplace continues to evolve, and it's very, very dynamic. My first introduction to IGP and International Grains Program was in 1991 when I was working for a commercial company in Kansas City and came up to speak to a group of Russians. They were the biggest grain buyers in the world that day. Today, Russia's the biggest grain exporter in the world. So things changed significantly. I think they've changed in different ways. Australia went through this whole deregulation debate and issue, which changed their whole market structure quite significantly. Paying premiums for quality wheat rather than fair average quality. They still have some supply chain issues, particularly on their domestic rail systems just post World War II, making some improvements, but it's a challenge. and their road system isn't as developed as ours, basically because of the tyranny of distance that you face down there. But they face a lot of the similar issues. You mentioned the GMO, the grain quality issues. There's a number of things and issues that the U.S. and Australia share when addressing that global marketplace. And how do you facilitate that? We both advocate they want fair trade and an open marketplace in a global situation. One of the biggest dichotomies, and Australia and U.S. are a good comparison of that. The U.S. is the residual store of grain in the world.
Right.
And there's a reason for that. One is access to capital, and two is the capacity to manage price risk over multiple seasons. Australia, under statutory marketing, and it still sits there, is their definition of market failure is if they don't clear a single season's crop, they consider that to be market failure, which I would take exception to that. But that's still how they define it. So when you have a country, whether it's Argentina or Australia or Canada, that defines their market, their incentive is to clear a year's production, well, the U.S. becomes the store of grain.
Yeah.
That said, one dichotomy we have in there is China. China is the world's largest wheat producer. They're also the largest carrier of inventory year to year. And as I said, you need capital investment and you need to manage price risk. Well, in China and some countries, the entity taking that price risk is the government, because they're storing that grain for a food security, food safety issue. And as we've seen this whole global supply-demand situation become very, very tight, soybeans, corn, cotton, a lot of these commodities are historically as tight as they've ever been.
Right.
Wheat is moving in that direction. Wheat being a food grain is very, very important for a lot of reasons on that. And one thing we're looking at today is wheat becomes an increasing focus of food security for a lot of nations, whether we're talking about, most recently Pakistan,
right,
China, even Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey, sort of issues on that. Wheat's going to have to stay priced out of the feed grain ration for the most part, because we can't afford to feed as much to cattle. Coming from western Kansas, where a lot of our hard red winter wheat goes to that cattle market, we scratch our head, yeah, I'd agree with that, but that's where the price is. But increasingly so, we have to keep wheat priced out of the feed ration globally. And then there's that matter of what's the world, or country by country, are we comfortable with as carryover stocks and addressing the food security issue.
Yeah. Well, there's some big thoughts to conclude with here today. I think you hit the nail on the head right there, and we've got our own issues here in Kansas. Specifically this year, a lot of talk about water in western Kansas, and I'm sure that's impactful in Australia too. So, Guy, we appreciate your time today. I think we'll probably have you back a couple of other times to dig a little bit deeper into this.
Very good. Thank you.
That concludes this episode of Wheats on Your Mind podcasts. My thanks to Guy Allen for joining us. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at podcast@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.